Hello, and welcome to the first episode of 7 Minutes of Sport. I'm Christina, your host for this podcast, and today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined for our first ever episode by Whyte KC. Anne is someone who I am quite sure to the listeners of this podcast does not even need an introduction, as she is an incredibly experienced and talented silk at the top of her fields, which include crime and public law. Now, for the purposes of the podcast today, she has come to be interviewed about the Whyte Review, which she completed in 2022. This was a lengthy independent review into the allegations of abuse in the sport of gymnastics after disclosure was made to the press in the summer of 2020 by several current and former British gymnasts about allegations of abuse within their sport. These allegations came after the airing on Netflix of the American documentary called Athlete A about sexual abuse within the sport of gymnastics. I am very grateful for Anne for having given up time in her very busy schedule to be interviewed by me today. So Anne, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Just a reminder to all listeners, if you have not had a little listen to the introductory episode, the interview with Anne will be 7 minutes in length. So I have a timer with me, so we stick to the timing. So the only thing left is, Anne, are you ready?
I am, thank you.
Right, I will start the timer. So for those listeners who are not aware of the review, how did the review come about and what would you say was its purpose?
Well, as you've already explained to the listeners, the review came about after the airing of a documentary called Athlete A on Netflix, which exposed long-standing issues of sexual abuse within the high performance program of American women's gymnastics, and a sense that the body governing gymnastics in America had failed to do enough to prevent the abuse. As a consequence, a number of former and current elite British gymnasts spoke out in the media about issues of abuse in British gymnastics and a sense that they felt that their concerns had not properly been addressed by British gymnastics. As a result, Sport England and UK Sport commissioned me to investigate the culture in British gymnastics and to investigate whether gymnasts had felt disinhibited from raising complaints, and if so, why that might be. And they also wanted me to investigate how complaints had generally been managed by British gymnastics and whether the welfare of gymnastics had been at the centre of the culture of the sport.
Now, as we only have 7 minutes, we are just going to focus on one narrow area of the review, which is the coach-led culture. What did you conclude about the impact of coach-led culture on the well-being of gymnasts?
I made a number of conclusions about the consequences of what I found to be coach-led culture within the sport of British gymnastics, particularly at the high performance end. It reflected itself in unnecessarily and misinformed weight management practices, which caused gymnasts to approach the issues of diet and weight management in a way that could put them at a risk of mental and physical harm. I felt that the coach-led culture left many gymnasts feeling undervalued and insignificant because their autonomy had been suppressed from often a very early age, so that they had no sense of what we sometimes call the athlete's voice. This in turn had led to a culture of fear amongst certain aspects of the high performance world programs, and it led to a very obvious power imbalance between gymnasts and coaches, which was often reflected by a high or excessive degree of control on the part of the coaches. So there was a dysfunctional dynamic at the heart, particularly of the elite end of business, which in consequence affected the gymnast welfare in a number of ways, including a sense that they weren't able to complain about any issues that they felt were inappropriate.
Now, an important part of the review looked into the education of coaches. Can you explain why you concluded coaches' education to be so important?
I felt that the basic structure of coach education in the sport of gymnastics had not kept up with societal change and understanding. It was extremely technical in nature. So it explained to the coaches what they should be teaching rather than how they should be teaching it. And this, I felt, had an impact on the relationship between coaches and gymnasts and the general culture of the sport. I don't think coaches were taught enough about welfare issues and why the opinions of gymnasts matter. I felt that coaches hadn't been taught enough about the fact that gymnastics is an early specialisation sport, especially for females, and that there are consequences to that physically, mentally, in terms of education and social life, which hadn't been fully appreciated by coaches or respected. I felt that coaches had not been educated sufficiently about weight management, and they took a somewhat oversimplistic view according to weight management issues of body image and aesthetics rather than body composition. I felt that coaches had not been taught enough about the standards of conduct and how they should be reflected in methods of coaching. And I also felt that coaches had not been taught enough about definitions of emotional and physical abuse, so that when they were treating gymnasts in a certain way or requiring gymnasts to do certain things in training, they might not be aware that their requirements were excessive and could put the gymnasts at risk of emotional or physical harm. And that reflected itself, I think, in issues such as how long should a gymnast train, when should a gymnast train, how many repetitions should a gymnast do, should a gymnast train on injury, and if so, to what extent, how should the flexibility of gymnasts be managed. So all of those physical aspects of training, I felt, had not been properly explored in coach education throughout all the levels of coaches, from the most junior to the most senior and national coaches. And I also felt and found that coaches had not been adequately taught about safeguarding and what it means and how it should be represented within a sporting context.
And that is fantastic. That is the timer. So that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for having joined us. And as I said, I'm so grateful you've given up some of your time to speak with me. And I know that I could have spoken about this for far longer than 7 minutes, and I'm sure the listeners would have liked to listen to it for longer as well. For all the listeners out there, the final Whyte review was 309 pages in length. You can find that online as a PDF, and I do encourage you go online and have a read of it in its entirety to have an in-depth study of the findings. And it is very eye-opening, to say the least. Thank you once again, Anne, and thank you to the listeners who have tuned in for this episode. Do join us next week for episode 2 of this season. We will have another esteemed guest being interviewed. But until then, bye-bye.